She was a quiet, 69-year-old woman just boarding a plane to visit her son. She wore pearls, carried a soft brown handbag, and asked for nothing more than the seat she had paid for. But when the flight attendant looked at her, what did she see? A passenger or a problem? What happened next left an entire cabin speechless. Within minutes, her dignity was questioned. Within 30 minutes, the entire crew was fired, and within a week, the airline would never be the same again. But who was she? Really? What power did her silence hold, and what would happen when her son, the man no one recognized, stepped forward? This isn't just a story about injustice. It's about stillness as resistance, about a mother's quiet strength, and a son's reckoning with the system he helped build. So sit back, listen closely, and ask yourself, what would you have done on that plane if this story moves you? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, because some stories don't shout, they whisper, and still change everything. Now, let's begin. The terminal lights shimmered across the polished floor of Denver International Airport, reflecting off the rolling suitcases and shuffling shoes of travelers preparing for Flight AV-26. It was an ordinary Thursday afternoon. A breeze of cold air brushed through the corridor near Gate C-18 as announcements echoed faintly overhead. Boarding for Aerovista Flight 226 to Los Angeles was beginning. First-class passengers were called. Evelyn Moore stood slowly from the bench where she had been sitting quietly. She smoothed the creases from her lavender blouse, tucked the corner of a small envelope into her handbag, and adjusted her glasses. Her movements were graceful, unhurried. At 69 years old, Evelyn had learned the art of stillness, how to move like she belonged, even in places that often told her otherwise. She walked calmly toward the boarding lane, her boarding pass held gently in her hand. There was no rush, no anxiety, just the quiet confidence of a woman who had spent decades choosing grace over anger. Her silver-gray hair was pulled into a soft twist at the nape of her neck. Her slacks were neatly pressed. Her shoes shined. She gave a polite nod to the gate agent and stepped onto the jet bridge. Inside the aircraft, the lights glowed warm above the leather seats of first class. Evelyn paused for a moment at row 2 and smiled softly. Seat 2C, window. It had been a birthday gift from her son, Christopher. He had insisted she travel in comfort this time. "You've taken care of everyone else long enough," he'd told her. "Let me take care of you." Evelyn lowered herself gently into the seat. She folded her hands in her lap and exhaled slowly, soaking in the unfamiliar softness of privilege. For a moment, it felt like peace. But peace doesn't always last long in places where you're not expected to be. A voice, sharp and unsmiling, sliced through the hum of boarding passengers. "Ma'am, I need to see your boarding pass." Evelyn turned, surprised. A tall white woman in a Navy uniform stood beside her, holding a tablet. Her badge read Natalie Voss, Flight Supervisor. "I beg your pardon," Evelyn said calmly. Natalie didn't smile. "Seat 2C. I need to confirm you're in the correct seat." Evelyn's brows drew together gently. "Of course." She reached into her handbag and handed her the boarding pass, careful not to show offense. "It's right here." Natalie took it, but barely looked at it. Her eyes scanned Evelyn instead, her age, her skin, her simple jewelry. Something in her expression flickered. Then, without lowering her voice, Natalie said, "First class isn't a shelter. Ma'am, You can't just walk in and sit down wherever you like." The words fell hard. Passengers nearby turned their heads. A man in 1A looked up from his phone. A couple in 3B glanced toward them, frowning. Evelyn's face stayed composed, but her fingers tightened around her handbag strap. "I didn't just walk in," she said quietly. "This seat was booked for me." Natalie shook her head, her tone clipped. "Please stand up. We'll sort it out near the front." Before Evelyn could respond, a man in his 50s with thinning blonde hair and a voice thick with irritation brushed past her. "Guess we're letting anyone in up here these days," he muttered as he dropped into the very seat Evelyn had just been asked to leave. Natalie didn't stop him. Evelyn stood slowly, gathering her bag. "This is my seat," she repeated, voice firmer now. Natalie turned to another crew member nearby, a young white man with a name tag that read Jared Fisk. "Escort her to the front jump seat while we verify," Natalie said briskly. "We'll reassign if needed." Jared nodded, a small smirk curling at the corner of his lips. "Coach wandered up front again," he said under his breath. "Not quiet enough." Evelyn blinked. Her heart thudded once against her ribs. She followed Jared to the galley area, where a folding jump seat sat unused beside a metal panel. It wasn't meant for passengers. It was a place for off-duty crew. A seat with no view, no comfort, no dignity. Evelyn sat slowly, adjusting the hem of her blouse. She said nothing. She refused to let her voice crack. Behind her, she could still hear the shuffle of passengers boarding, the overhead bins clicking shut, the rustle of travel bags. Life was going on as if nothing had happened, as if she had vanished. Passenger seated in 2C. Natalie's voice announced over the intercom, flat and clipped. "We are reviewing your ticket. Please remain off the main aisle." The announcement wasn't necessary, but it was heard by everyone. Laughter came from 2 rows back. Evelyn didn't turn around. Jared passed by her again and looked her up and down with open judgment. "She looks like she wandered in from the wrong part of town," he whispered to Natalie. Evelyn heard it. She closed her eyes. Her breath trembled slightly. She reached for her phone. The screen lit up with a familiar photo her son, smiling in front of his office building, Christopher Moore, CEO of Aerovista Airlines. She hit the call button. He answered on the second ring. "Mom, everything okay?" Evelyn swallowed hard. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "They took my seat. Chris, they said I don't belong here." There was a long pause. On the other end of the call, she could almost hear the shift in his breathing. A silence she recognized quiet, controlled, but full of fire. "I'll be there before they close that cabin door," Christopher said. "Don't move. Just stay exactly where you are." Then he hung up. Evelyn sat still, her hand still holding the phone. Behind her, passengers laughed again. A flight attendant offered champagne to Douglas Crane in her original seat. No one looked at her, except one. Leah Tran, a young flight attendant standing near the beverage cart, hesitated. Her eyes flicked to Evelyn. She saw everything the way Evelyn sat, like she was shrinking into the wall, the way her hands trembled slightly. She stepped forward quietly. "Here," Leah said, crouching. She handed Evelyn a bottle of water and folded a napkin into her palm. Inside the napkin was something small, a handwritten note. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "This isn't right." And then she stood up and disappeared again. Before Natalie could see, Evelyn looked down at the note. It said, "You're not alone." Her fingers closed around it gently. She let out a quiet breath, not a sob, just a breath. And then she looked up, calm, composed, and unshakable. Whatever they thought of her, whatever seat they thought she didn't deserve. They were about to find out exactly who she was. Evelyn sat stiffly on the metal jump seat near the galley, knees pressed close, purse folded tightly in her lap. Around her, the bustle of the cabin continued. Wheels scraped overhead bins. A baby cried softly somewhere in the back. Laughter floated from first class like champagne bubbles, sharp, careless, unaware. The jump seat had no padding. It wasn't made for passengers, and certainly not for women like Evelyn, who had paid, prepared, and walked with grace her entire life. Across the aisle, Natalie Voss reviewed the manifest on her tablet with robotic calm. Her lips pursed. She tapped a stylus against the screen as though the weight of this moment was merely administrative, nothing personal, just policy. She didn't glance Evelyn's way, not once. Nearby, Jared Fisk stood with arms crossed, whispering something to another crew member as he smirked in Evelyn's direction. "She looks lost, like she just wandered up from baggage claim," he said, barely hiding his tone. "Maybe she thinks we're running a charity now." The other attendant chuckled politely and turned away, but Leah Tran heard it. From her position by the service cart, she paused, frozen in a hesitation. Her training screamed protocol. Her gut whispered something else. Conscience. Evelyn's fingers tapped gently against her handbag, not in anger, but to steady herself. Her gaze stayed low. She'd learned that when you're the one being stared at, the one being made small, sometimes the only armor you have is silence. Natalie raised her voice, speaking into the intercom. "Attention, passenger previously seated in 2C. Your boarding verification is still pending. Please remain near the forward galley. We will update shortly." Evelyn's eyes lifted. Her name wasn't used, but she didn't need to hear it. The announcement was deliberate, sharp as a slap, designed for volume, designed for effect. The passenger seated in Evelyn's place, Douglas Crane, chuckled. He leaned back, splayed out like a man claiming territory. "Must be hard keeping up appearances," he said aloud, not to anyone in particular, but just loud enough. "So many trying to play first class when they're not built for it." Someone a row behind coughed awkwardly. Another man turned away, avoiding the tension. Evelyn said nothing, but inside, her mind moved, not with rage, not with panic, but with memory. She thought of all the times she had been mistaken for less. When she was 26, newly widowed, wearing her Sunday coat at a downtown bank, the teller had assumed she was there to clean, not to make a deposit. She had smiled then, too. When Christopher was 10 and she took him to a science fair, a security guard followed them through every aisle like shadows didn't belong among microscopes. She remembered squeezing her son's hand and whispering, "Keep your head up, baby. We belong here." And now, here she was again, grown older, grown tired, and still proven. Still sitting where she was told instead of where she'd been invited. Leah approached again, gently, almost timid. "Ma'am, may I check your water?" she asked. Evelyn nodded softly. Leah crouched low and whispered, "The passenger manifest confirms your seat. I saw it. You were right." Evelyn looked at her, quietly. "Then why am I sitting here?" she asked. Leah hesitated. Natalie said it's a verification issue, that we're following procedure. Evelyn's voice dropped, almost a breath. protocol is just prejudice with a clipboard if you use it to shame someone. Leah flinched. She nodded slowly and slipped away before Natalie could see. At that moment, Evelyn's phone buzzed gently in her lap. It was a message from Christopher. "Boarding my jet now. Sit tight. I'm coming through that door in minutes." Her throat tightened. Not from fear, from resolve. She typed back with shaking hands. "They said I didn't look like I belonged. You told me I always have." No response came immediately, but she didn't need one. She could feel her son rising, moving through terminals, cutting through silence. Behind her, another comment from Douglas floated in the air like poison. Probably just another refund flyer trying to sneak a free upgrade. The system's too soft these days. He sipped his drink and laughed to himself. Roderick Hale, seated in 4D, shifted in his seat. A retired school teacher with a salt and pepper beard and a sharp eye. He had been watching since Evelyn first entered the cabin. He didn't know her name, but he saw what was happening, and he had seen enough. He pulled out his phone and began recording. "This is Aerovista Flight 226, he said quietly into the camera. "That woman was just publicly removed from her seat. She had a valid pass. Everyone saw it. She's sitting by the galley like a criminal." He stopped recording and uploaded the clip. Hashtag your AV226 shame within minutes. It began to spread. Back near the galley. Jared passed Evelyn again and muttered with mock cheer, "Don't worry. We'll find you a nice spot and coach. Might even get a window." Evelyn didn't respond, but she turned slowly, looked him in the eye for the first time, and said in a low voice, "I paid for that seat. I earned it, and I won't let you make me feel like I didn't." Jared blinked. He stepped back without replying. Natalie glanced over from her tablet, clearly annoyed. She walked back down the aisle to Douglas. "We may need to reassign shortly," she said. Douglas scoffed. "Let me guess. She's causing a scene now." "Not yet," Natalie said under her breath, "but she's about to." Roderick watched it all. His phone buzzed again. 50,000 views in under 10 minutes. Leah approached him, quietly. "You filming this?" she asked. Roderick nodded. "Good," she said. Leah returned to the galley, where Evelyn still sat upright, spine like iron. A different kind of hush had settled over first class now, not just tension, awareness. Passengers were listening more carefully, watching, measuring how far this would go. A woman in 3A leaned toward her husband and whispered, "She hasn't even raised her voice. Why are they treating her like a threat?" A young man behind them began recording. 2. Evelyn reached into her purse and took out the napkin Leah had given her. She unfolded it slowly. "Still there. You're not alone." For a moment, Evelyn closed her eyes. She remembered Christopher as a child, sitting beside her on the city bus, watching her face as a man shouted at her to move back. She remembered saying nothing, just holding her son's hand tighter. She wouldn't be silent now. She stood up, not rushed, not theatrical, just stood, and turned toward the front of the cabin. Natalie's voice rang out over the intercom again. "Passenger seated near the galley, please return to your designated courtesy seat." Evelyn spoke, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I have a valid first-class ticket. You saw it, you ignored it. You gave my seat to someone else without reason, and I will not sit in shame while others pretend this is normal." There was a long silence, then Roderick's voice from behind her. "We've got your back, ma'am. Say what you need to say." Evelyn lifted her chin. Her voice was calm, unwavering. "My name is Evelyn Moore, and I do belong here." The tension on Flight 226 was now heavy enough to taste. Conversations that once hummed with travel chatter had turned into murmurs and side glances. First class, once filled with confident silence and clinking glasses, had become a theater of awkward restraint. Evelyn Moore remained standing, a calm but immovable figure near the galley, her voice still lingering in the air like a challenge that couldn't be walked back. Natalie Voss, stiff-backed and defensive, pulled Jared Fisk aside near the beverage prep station. She whispered, but didn't bother to lower her voice enough. "She's creating a spectacle. We need her to sit down before this escalates." Jared crossed his arms and tilted his head toward the seated passengers. "Too late. Look around. Every phone's out now." Natalie glanced down the cabin. He was right. 3 phones were clearly recording. More were likely tucked behind seatbacks, discreet but determined. She cursed under her breath and turned toward the intercom. But before she could touch the handset, Leah Tran stepped in front of her. "Don't," Leah said quietly. Natalie narrowed her eyes. "Excuse me if you make another announcement targeting her. It'll be even worse. We already look bad. We're following protocol." Natalie snapped. "No, you're hiding behind it," Leah replied. "I checked the manifest myself. Evelyn Moore is listed in 2C. You handed her seat to a man who didn't have a boarding pass for first class." Natalie's jaw tightened. Her response was cold. "And now you're siding with a disruptive passenger over your lead bold move?" "Leah." "It's not bold," Leah replied. "It's right." For a moment, the 2 women stood locked in a silent standoff. Then Natalie brushed past her, ignoring the warning in Leah's tone, and moved toward the cockpit. She needed backup. As she knocked and entered, Captain Elias Monroe turned in his chair. "Everything all right up there?" he asked. Natalie hesitated. "We have a boarding issue. A woman claiming a seat in first class wasn't on the approved list. She's now refusing to sit anywhere else. It's creating disruption. Phones are out. It's spreading." The captain raised an eyebrow. She refused to sit because she had the seat, or because she wanted it. She claims she had it, Natalie said, choosing her words carefully, but she couldn't produce a scannable boarding pass. The gate agent must have made a mistake. Monroe nodded, absorbing the words. "Was it a gate error or ours? I don't know yet," she replied. "Find out," he said firmly. "Because if she had that seat, and she's standing because we gave it away, that's not a boarding issue, that's a liability, and we're not going wheels up until we know." Natalie's expression faltered for a split second before she nodded and left the cockpit. Back in the cabin, Evelyn had finally eased into a standing lean against the bulkhead. Not because she was surrendering, but because her knees ached. She'd stood long enough to feel it in her bones, but her dignity refused to sit. Roderick Hale, still filming occasionally, leaned forward toward her. "Ma'am," he said gently, "my live stream's trending. Local news picked it up. People are asking who you are." Evelyn gave him a tired smile. "I'm just someone who's had to stand one too many times in her life." From the tarmac below, at gate B42, a private black SUV rolled to a stop. The back door opened, and Christopher Moore stepped out. He wore no suit, no tie, just a charcoal pullover and gray slacks. Still, he moved with the unmistakable stillness of power, quiet, precise, aware. His assistant, Danielle Brooks was already waiting by the jetway gate, her tablet blinking with notifications. "Christopher," she said breathlessly, "the video's gone viral. Your mother's name is attached now. It's not just public, it's personal." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched the plane outside the glass wall. His mother was on that plane. She was in pain, possibly embarrassed, certainly disrespected. He could feel it without needing to see her. His voice was low and firm. "Get me on that flight, now." Danielle hesitated. "They're prepped for takeoff. Final checks already called in. Then uncheck them." He strode toward the gate agent, flashed his ID badge, the one few ever saw, and spoke 3 words that shifted the mood instantly. "Boarding override authorization. Back on the plane." Natalie returned to the galley, only to find that Evelyn was now speaking calmly with Leah. The tone wasn't aggressive, just composed. "I never asked for a parade," Evelyn was saying, "just a seat I paid for." Natalie stepped forward. "Ms. Moore," she said, feigning politeness, "the captain has asked that you remain seated until we can clarify the manifest details. We understand there was a miscommunication at boarding. These things happen. You understand." Evelyn turned to her, then to Leah, then to the watching faces, and for the first time, she allowed a trace of her anger to show. "I understand," she said, "that you saw an elderly black woman in first class and assumed it was a mistake. That's what I understand." Natalie's face hardened. "I won't be accused of something I didn't do." "You don't have to call it racism," Evelyn said, "but you should call it what it is. Bias. You didn't ask. You acted." Suddenly, the forward door opened. A gust of jetway air swept through the cabin. Heads turned, and there he was. Christopher Moore stepped aboard, his presence instantly commanding. His eyes scanned the cabin, landing on his mother first. She straightened slightly, but her eyes told him everything. She was hurt. He turned to Natalie. "Who's in charge here?" Natalie blinked. I am lead flight attendant." He nodded. "You removed Evelyn Moore from her assigned first-class seat. You replaced her with a standby passenger who lacked clearance. Is that correct? I followed protocol. She couldn't provide a digital scan at the time of boarding. She's my mother." The entire cabin froze. Passengers gasped. Jared paled. "I'm Christopher Moore," he continued, "CEO of Aravista Airlines, and this flight. This team, you report to me." Natalie stammered. "We didn't know." "Sir." Christopher stepped closer. "That's the problem. You didn't ask. You didn't verify. You assumed." Leah stepped forward, her voice low. "She's telling the truth. I saw the manifest. Evelyn Moore was always booked in 2C. Christopher nodded. Then he turned to his mother. "Come with me, Mom." She moved slowly, but with grace. As she reached him, he placed his hand on her shoulder not for control, but solidarity. They turned back to face the stunned crew. Christopher's voice was calm. "This flight is grounded until further notice. No one moves. No one takes off. Internal review is now active." A beat passed. Then the intercom crackled. Captain Monroe's voice came through. "Understood. Standing by." A ripple of reaction spread through the cabin. Passengers looked at one another. Some nodded in support. Others, silent before, now clapped quietly. Evelyn, standing beside her son, looked forward. Not for applause, but because she refused to look down ever again. The cabin of Flight 226 had grown unnaturally quiet. Passengers shifted in their seats. watching as Christopher Moore stood near the forward galley, speaking softly with the captain over a secure line. His voice was low but decisive. No shouting, no panic, just calm leadership. That kind of authority didn't need volume to echo. Evelyn sat now, finally in seat 2C where she was always meant to be. But her body didn't relax. Her back remained straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Every wrinkle in her blouse was a map of resistance. She didn't need to make noise. The silence around her spoke enough. Across the aisle, Douglas Crane had finally removed his coat. His eyes flicked nervously from Evelyn to the flight attendants. He'd been unusually quiet since Christopher arrived, but the tightness in his jaw suggested he hadn't absorbed the gravity of the moment. Natalie Voss was pacing behind the curtain, her steps sharp and clipped. Every second the plane stayed grounded meant another potential headline, another blow to the airline's already fragile reputation, and she was right in the middle of it. Jared Fisk sat at the rear of first class, tapping his fingers against the drink cart. The confidence he once wore like cologne had thinned. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just a delay. This was something else, something institutional. Leah Tran, meanwhile, stood near row 3, arms crossed. She wasn't smiling. This wasn't a victory. It was a turning point, and she knew turning points often came with consequences for everyone involved. From the cockpit, Captain Elias Monroe exited and joined Christopher and Danielle Brooks just inside the galley. Captain Monroe spoke first. "We're holding on the ground. Towers confirmed delay clearance for the next 30, but after that, they'll force a reassign." Christopher nodded. "I'll have this wrapped before then." Danielle checked her tablet. Notifications poured in. Public support, outrage, press inquiries. Even major outlets had started to comment on the story. Not just the incident, but the woman at the center of it. The name Evelyn Moore was trending in real time. Christopher turned to her. "Quietly initiate the internal audit protocol. Flag the cabin crew's history. I want to know how many similar complaints have been buried under procedural language." Danielle hesitated. "That'll trigger a full-chain response. HR, legal, the union." "I know." He looked out over the cabin again. Evelyn sat still. Her hands didn't move. Do it anyway. As Danielle stepped away to a quieter corner, Christopher moved back toward his mother. He lowered himself to eye level beside her seat, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you all right?" Evelyn turned her head slowly. "I'm not broken," she said, "just tired." He nodded. "I know that feeling." She studied his face for a moment, the way he carried himself, even now. Calm, intentional, like someone who had spent years learning how to stay still while everyone else shouted. "You didn't have to come," she said gently. Christopher gave a soft smile. "I always come." Their conversation was interrupted by a voice from a few rows behind. "So what now? We all just sit here while this circus plays out." It was Douglas Crane. His tone was clipped, irritable. He had taken off his shoes and was stretching his legs with entitlement. Christopher stood up slowly and turned to face him. "Mr. Crane, you're welcome to disembark if you find the situation unbearable, but I suggest you choose your next words carefully. This isn't a circus. It's a correction." Douglas scoffed. "I paid good money to be here." Christopher didn't blink. "And you were given a seat that belonged to someone else. My mother. That's not an upgrade. That's theft, dressed in entitlement." A few people clapped quietly. Douglas sank back in his seat. Evelyn let out a slow exhale. her eyes fixed on her son. She remembered him as a boy, quiet in school, thoughtful, often underestimated. The boy who once got detention for standing up to a teacher who embarrassed a classmate over his accent. He had always hated injustice. He had just learned to fight it with stillness instead of fire. Meanwhile, in the rear galley, Natalie Voss was whispering frantically into the crew's direct line. She wasn't ready to be the face of a scandal. Not like this. Not with cameras rolling and a CEO she didn't recognize now pulling the levers of power from inside the cabin. Leah stepped into view. "You're making it worse," she said. Natalie spun toward her. "Excuse me," Leah didn't raise her voice. "Covering it up. Dodging responsibility. It's all on camera now. There's no protocol that will protect you from what you said back there." Natalie narrowed her eyes. "You think siding with her is going to save your job?" Leah shook her head. "I'm not trying to save my job. I'm trying to save my conscience." Natalie's expression twisted. Then she turned away. Back in first class. Christopher addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your patience. As you may be aware, there was a boarding discrepancy involving a first-class seat. That error is now being corrected." He paused. What happened today was not simply a logistical failure, it was a human one, a decision based on appearance instead of verification. A moment where someone in power chose assumption over inquiry. There was a murmur of agreement. Christopher continued. "This company is not perfect. No system is, but how we respond to failure determines who we become. Today, we choose accountability." Roderick Hale leaned into the aisle, filming again. Christopher didn't flinch. Effective immediately. An internal review of this flight's crew will begin. This flight will be delayed until we complete that process. A man from the back asked loudly, "Why delay all of us?" "This isn't our fault," Christopher answered calmly. "Because allowing things to proceed as if nothing happened would send a message worse than delay. It would say, this is normal, and it's not." Evelyn looked up at her son and saw something unshakable in him. A quiet power. The same power that had carried her through every room where she wasn't wanted. The same force that told her, even in her 70s, she wasn't invisible. A few minutes later, the flight deck received clearance to push back again. The review had been acknowledged by HQ. Captain Monroe made a short announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are ready to resume our journey. We appreciate your grace and understanding. Please remain seated as we prepare for departure." As the engine stirred to life, Evelyn sat quietly in 2C, her seat, the one no one would take from her again. Christopher returned to his place beside her and took her hand for a brief moment. She didn't say, "Thank you." She didn't need to. The silence between them was its own kind of language. Outside the cabin, the plane rolled away from the gate, but inside, a different kind of journey had already begun. One not of miles, but of meaning. The plane had finally lifted off. Flight 226 was airborne, but the cabin remained suspended in an uneasy silence. Not the silence of peace, the silence of people trying to understand what they had just witnessed and what was still unfolding midair. In row 2C, Evelyn Moore sat upright, her seatbelt buckled, her handbag resting neatly by her feet. She stared at the tray table in front of her as if it were a courtroom bench. She hadn't touched the sparkling water the new attendant offered. Her silence wasn't out of fear, it was something else. Reflection, maybe, or something heavier. Evelyn didn't need vindication. She didn't seek spectacle. But even in her stillness, her presence reverberated through the cabin. Christopher Moore sat quietly beside her in 2D, occasionally checking his phone, his watch, his breathing. The CEO in him had re-engaged, but the son in him had never left. They were 38 minutes into the flight when a message popped up on his device. Danielle Brooks, the head of PR, had already begun preparing a statement. It was clean, rehearsed, and far too safe. He deleted the draft with a swipe and made a mental note to call her after the seatbelt sign went off. Meanwhile, a few rows back in seat 5A, Roderick Hale was still reviewing the footage on his phone. He'd caught everything. From the moment Evelyn was denied her seat to the awkward silence that fell after Christopher introduced himself as the owner. His fingers hovered over the upload button, but something stopped him. Not fear, not doubt. A question. Would this story become just another viral firework, bright, fast, forgotten? Or could it be something more? He glanced toward Evelyn. She wasn't trying to be a symbol. She just wanted dignity. That's what made it powerful. Up front, Natalie Voss was pacing again. Her face wore the expression of someone who had just remembered a very important deadline, one she was about to miss. She had pulled out the crew incident form and began typing on her tablet with exaggerated calm. Jared Fisk leaned over the galley counter, arms folded. "So what's the plan?" he whispered. "I don't know," Natalie replied flatly. "I thought he was just some regular guy. I didn't expect a CEO, and certainly not of our airline. He could ruin us," Jared muttered. "He could ruin me." Natalie snapped. "You just nodded along." Jared raised a brow. "I wasn't the one who called her a seat squatter." Natalie's jaw clenched. "Do you think they're recording this too?" He shrugged. "Probably. At this point, even the coffee pots might be wired." Natalie bit her lip and looked toward the curtain that separated first class from the galley. She felt like a child in a grown-up's courtroom. Only the jury was watching from plush leather seats, and the judge was sipping club soda. Leah Tran entered the galley quietly. "I'd stop digging if I were you," she said, not unkindly. Natalie flinched. "What are you talking about?" "The story's already out there," Leah replied. "You can either own your part in it or let it own you." "I didn't do anything wrong," Natalie hissed. "You didn't do anything right either," Leah said, then walked away. Christopher turned slightly in his seat, glancing at Evelyn again. She was now looking out the window, though clouds covered everything. The seatbelt sign dinged off. "I didn't know it had gotten this bad," he said softly. Evelyn didn't turn her head. "It didn't get this bad, son. It's always been this bad. You just haven't always been in the room to see it." Her words hit like a quiet bell. No echo, just resonance. Christopher's mind turned. He thought about the promotion packets he'd signed over the years, the incident summaries that passed his desk, always trimmed down and clinical, a disruption in the boarding process, a guest relations issue. He thought about how many Evelyns had passed through his airline unnoticed, unacknowledged. "Do you want to press charges?" he asked. Evelyn turned to him now. "No, I want you to fix the air we breathe. Not the one in this cabin, the one outside, the one our daughters walk through, the one our grandsons will inherit." Christopher sat back. "It'll cost me." Evelyn gave a small smile. "I raised you to be expensive." In the rear cabin, a young black couple who had witnessed the earlier incident leaned across the aisle. "Is that his mother?" the man whispered. Yeah. The woman nodded. And he's the CEO. Their conversation stopped when Roderick rose from his seat and walked forward. As he reached the first-class curtain, Jared stepped in front of him. Sorry, this area is for premium passengers only. Roderick looked him in the eye. I'm not trying to start anything, just trying to give something back. Christopher heard the commotion and stood, motioning Jared to step aside. It's all right, he said. Let him through. Roderick approached with a mix of nerves and purpose. I don't mean to intrude, he began, but I recorded what happened earlier, and I want you to know I haven't uploaded it yet. I thought maybe you'd want to tell the story first, in your words. Christopher studied him, then nodded slowly. Thank you for that. Roderick looked toward Evelyn. Ma'am, I just want to say I saw what happened, and I'm sorry. You deserve better. Evelyn gave a warm nod, her voice steady. I know I do. Thank you for seeing me. Roderick returned to his seat, but something had changed. That simple moment, the exchange of dignity, had transformed the cabin. Passengers looked at Evelyn differently now, not with pity, but with recognition. Christopher sat again and pulled out his phone. Danielle, he said quietly into the mic, we're going to do a video response, not a statement, not a press release, a conversation, where Danielle asked, from seat 2C. She was silent a moment, understood. The camera would roll soon, but not as a PR stunt. It would be raw, honest. The kind of honesty that corporations fear, but people trust. Evelyn smoothed the lines in her dress and turned to her son. If you're going to put a camera in front of me, she said, you better not edit out my wrinkles. He laughed. I wouldn't dare. Outside the plane, the sky was darkening, but inside, something rare was happening, something harder to measure than altitude or speed. Truth was being acknowledged, not in grand speeches, not with lawyers, just two people sitting in seats they had earned, quietly insisting that respect was not optional. And in that moment, at 36,000 feet, the storm wasn't outside, it was within, and it was just beginning. The cabin lights dimmed gently, casting a quiet hue across the first-class section of Flight 226. Evelyn Moore sat motionless, her posture composed, her gaze fixed on a single point far beyond the seat ahead. It was not fatigue that held her still. It was memory, not the sharp kind, but the soft, aching kind that loops through a person after they've endured something they didn't deserve. Christopher Moore, her son, had stepped away momentarily with Roderick Hale to coordinate a discreet video recording in the rear galley. Not for press, not for damage control, but because Evelyn had asked him a question most CEOs never get from their own mother. Will you let me speak without touching up my truth? He said yes, and now she waited. From her seat, Evelyn could hear the murmurs of conversation shifting around her. Passengers were talking about her, about what had happened, about who she was. Some whispered her name with new reverence. Others apologized in hushed tones to their seatmates, uncertain why the whole scene made their stomachs twist. A few were simply staring. Natalie Voss, the lead flight attendant, had retreated to the front galley, where she was now pacing again. Her confident steps from the boarding gate were gone. In their place, shallow breath, tapping fingernails, and the haunting realization that perception had flipped. She wasn't the authority anymore. She was the defendant. Jared Fisk sat in a jump seat, scrolling aimlessly through his phone, no longer eager to engage. It was dawning on him that what had started as a passing incident now had momentum. real, irreversible momentum. Leah Tran, the younger attendant, emerged with a quiet sense of purpose. She gently set down a cup of hot tea in front of Evelyn. "Chamomile, ma'am," she said softly. "No charge." Evelyn looked up, surprised by the sincerity in the young woman's eyes. "Thank you," she said. "You've been kind." Leah hesitated. "I should have spoken up sooner." "You did," Evelyn replied. "You didn't scream, but you stood." Leah bowed slightly before stepping away. In that small gesture, there was a powerful exchange. Meanwhile, Christopher stood beside Roderick in the galley. His phone angled properly, mic tested, lighting adjusted. No cuts. He told Roderick, no music, no edits. This is not a brand moment. It's a truth moment. Roderick nodded and hit record. Christopher looked into the camera with the kind of directness that made silence fall. "My name is Christopher Moore. I'm the CEO of Aerovista Airlines, but today, I'm just a son." He paused. "On this flight, my mother, Evelyn Moore, was humiliated, not by accident, not by policy, but by bias. Plain and simple," he continued, not raising his voice, not flinching. "She paid for a first-class seat. She was denied access. She was called a squatter. She was asked to prove she belonged. Meanwhile, a white man who didn't pay was seated with a smile." Roderick swallowed hard behind the lens. "I wish I could say this is the first time something like this happened on my airline, but I would be lying. I've seen the reports, I've read the excuses, I've approved settlements and swept away shame with the right language, but today it sat beside me." Christopher turned slightly to the side. "I can't fix every injustice in the air, but I can start here. This crew will not finish this flight. A replacement team is already being coordinated. Internal investigations are underway, and more importantly, new accountability systems are being built, not by consultants, by people like my mother." Roderick's hands trembled slightly as he hit stop. That's going to shake the ground," he said quietly. Christopher looked at him, then let it shake. Back in first class. Evelyn sipped the chamomile tea. She didn't need to see the video to know what her son had said. She had heard it in his voice before he even stood. The intercom buzzed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We want to thank you for your continued patience. In light of recent circumstances, we will be making adjustments to our cabin crew personnel upon landing. Please remain seated unless otherwise instructed. We appreciate your understanding." Gasps, whispers, stares. For Natalie, it felt like a guillotine in real time. She rushed to the cockpit door. "You're replacing the entire crew mid-flight," she hissed. Captain Elias Monroe turned to her with calm precision. "I don't make those decisions, but I follow protocol, and the protocol now is step aside." She didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mouth opened, but the authority she had clung to was gone. In 2C, Evelyn set down her tea. Her eyes drifted to the seat in front of her. Someone had left a magazine sticking out of the seat pocket. The headline read, "What Defines Leadership?" She smiled to herself, almost ironically. Leadership wasn't what got her the seat, but maybe it was what would keep another woman from being removed from hers. She never asked to be a symbol, never wanted her story to be paraded around like a trophy or weapon, but she had long known this sometimes. The world doesn't ask you if you want to be a turning point. It simply turns, and you're standing there. Christopher returned to his seat beside her, eyes red but clear. "You all right?" he asked. Evelyn nodded. "I'm all right. You were incredible back there. I was just sitting," she said. "It's the world that finally looked." Christopher looked at her with the quiet reverence of a man who understood something profound. Evelyn had never raised her voice, never called for security, never demanded justice. She had done something far more powerful. She had stayed in her seat, and because she stayed, the entire plane was about to change. The wheels of Flight 226 kissed the tarmac at Jefferson International Airport with a quiet thud. But inside the cabin, the silence was anything but gentle. Passengers exchanged glances as if something sacred had passed through them, unspoken but understood. Captain Elias Monroe's voice broke through the overhead system, calm but final. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Jefferson International. Please remain seated. There will be a brief delay before deplaning as we coordinate with ground personnel. Thank you again for your patience." Patience. It was a word many passengers now viewed differently. What they had just witnessed stretched beyond inconvenience or turbulence. It was a reckoning at 30,000 feet, and now it was touching ground. Evelyn Moore didn't move. She folded her hands in her lap and took a long breath. Her son, Christopher Moore, glanced at her with quiet concern. "You don't have to say anything," he whispered. She nodded slowly. "I know, but maybe I will." From the galley, Leah Tran emerged cautiously, her eyes scanning the cabin. Natalie Voss and Jared Fisk remained where they were, both locked in their own quiet storms. Jared kept his gaze low, tapping his foot anxiously. Natalie clutched a folded paper in her hand, a printed passenger manifest. Now, useless. Outside the aircraft, a second team of flight attendants was already approaching the plane. Uniforms crisp, posture alert. This wasn't just a replacement crew. It was a message. Back in first class, Roderick Hale stood up slowly and addressed the cabin, his phone still recording in his hand. "Before we all get up, I just want to say this. What happened on this flight was more than wrong. It was habitual, the kind of thing black and brown folks experience all the time, but usually in silence. But not today, not with cameras, and not with her." He motioned gently toward Evelyn. Some passengers clapped, some lowered their heads, ashamed. One woman whispered, "I'm sorry," without knowing who she was saying it to. Leah approached Evelyn and handed her a small envelope. "It's not much," she said, "but it's something I wanted to give you. I wrote it during the flight." Evelyn opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. "For every time you were told to move, please remember your presence changed where we're headed. Thank you for staying seated." Evelyn folded it slowly, eyes glistening. Christopher gently stood up and looked over the aisle. He knew the next few moments would ripple far beyond this aircraft. The boarding door opened with a sharp click. Standing just outside was Danielle Brooks, Aerovista's head of communications. She wore a sleek navy blazer and had a professional calm that matched Christopher's when she stepped on board. Natalie stiffened. Jared stood up as if expecting to be interrogated. But Danielle didn't approach them. Instead, she walked directly to Evelyn. "Mrs. Moore," she said gently, "my name is Danielle. I work for your son, but today I answer to you." Evelyn raised her eyebrows slightly. "Then answer me this. What happens next?" Danielle knelt slightly to meet her eye level. "What happens next is accountability, and not just in this cabin, in our policies, our hiring, our training, and the silence we've let sit too long." Evelyn stared at her for a moment, then nodded. "Good," she said, "but make sure this doesn't end up on a poster with my face on it." Danielle smiled softly. Understood. The deplaning process began, but it moved differently now. Slower, more deliberate. Passengers took time to look around, to notice each other. Some even shook Evelyn's hand. A few asked to hug her. Christopher helped his mother stand. She gripped his arm, not because she was weak, but because the moment required both of them. Natalie Voss remained frozen. As the new flight crew entered, she was gently but firmly approached by airport personnel. No handcuffs, no shouting, just a quiet escort to a side corridor. Her expression was unreadable. Jared followed shortly after. Shoulders slumped, murmuring that he didn't mean anything by it, that it had just been a bad read. No one responded. Outside the gate, cameras flashed. News had spread faster than expected. Not just about a CEO's mother being humiliated, but about how the company had responded, about how one woman's stillness disrupted a system. Danielle stepped between the press and Evelyn, shielding her gently. "No questions today," she said. "There will be a formal statement tomorrow, right now. This family deserves space." Christopher led his mother through the terminal toward a private lounge area. It was quiet, cool, and lined with tall glass windows overlooking the runway. As they sat, Evelyn broke the silence. "I've flown my whole life," she said. "As a nurse, as a grandmother, I've watched security guards look through me, watched flight attendants smile at the man behind me but frown at me, watched passengers assume I was lost or in the wrong cabin. But this time, I stayed." Christopher sat beside her, both listening and grieving. "I've always told you to stay calm," she continued, "to be gracious. But today made me question something. Does grace mean silence?" He shook his head. "No, Mama, it means standing without screaming. It means holding the mirror steady enough so others finally look." They sat in quiet again. The glass in front of them reflected the airplane they had just exited, a silhouette against the golden hour light. Roderick entered the lounge and approached quietly. "Your message is everywhere," he said, showing his phone. "It's trending. Not just because of what happened, but because you didn't let it harden you." Evelyn looked up. "I don't want to be famous, young man." Roderick chuckled. "You're not. You're necessary. Outside." The sun began to dip lower. Evelyn rose and walked toward the window. "Let them talk," she said softly. "Let them remember. But let's not let this be the end of the story. Let it be the first flight of something better." Roderick nodded, overcome with quiet emotion. Christopher watched his mother with the admiration of a man who understood just how rare it was to see strength that didn't need to shout. The whole crew had been fired, but something deeper had landed, a standard, a question, a reason to stay seated until the world learned how to stand. By the next morning, Evelyn Moore's face was on the front page of nearly every major news outlet, not because she wanted it, but because someone, somewhere, had finally decided that dignity was newsworthy. A headline on one screen read, "Black Woman Refused First-Class Seat. CEO Sun Fires Entire Crew Midair." Another, "A Quiet Stand. Evelyn Moore's Story Sparks Industry Review." Inside the plush conference room of Aerovista Airlines headquarters in Dallas, the atmosphere was tense. The room was filled with board members, corporate lawyers, PR strategists, and department heads, many of whom had never met Evelyn, but all of whom had now seen the viral video dozens of times. Christopher Moore sat at the head of the table, calm, controlled, a man who had learned not to flinch when power rooms grew cold. But today, his voice would not be quiet. "This isn't about bad PR," Christopher began. "It's about rotten assumptions. It's about who we've been hiring, who we've been promoting, and who we've been quietly ignoring." Some shifted in their seats. One executive cleared his throat, prepared to object, but Christopher raised a hand. "Let me be clear. This isn't just a personal matter. It became personal when the company I led told my mother without saying it in words that she didn't belong, that her seat was too good for her, that her presence was inconvenient. And it's not the first time that's happened to someone who looks like her." Danielle Brooks, seated to his right, nodded silently. She had spent the past 12 hours fielding media calls, drafting statements, and working closely with crisis advisors. But the one thing she hadn't done was silence the truth. "This isn't about spin," Danielle added. "This is about responsibility. If we don't act with transparency, we'll lose the very trust that built this airline." Christopher leaned forward, locking eyes with each board member. "We're conducting a full audit. Every crew member on that flight will be interviewed, every past complaint reopened, and every systemic gap will be closed. I'm not asking for opinions. I'm informing you of the new standard. No one argued, because they couldn't, because the entire country had already begun that conversation without them." Meanwhile, back in Atlanta, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, sipping from a chipped mug painted with tiny violets. She had declined every interview request, turned down every podcast, every sit-down with morning shows. She had no interest in becoming a symbol. She was still a woman, still a mother, still a citizen who had simply wanted to sit in the seat her son had booked for her. Her phone buzzed again. Leah Tran, the young flight attendant. Evelyn hesitated, then answered. "Mrs. Moore," Leah began softly. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "You're not," Evelyn said gently. "But you sound like you're carrying something." There was a pause, then a trembling breath. "I put in my notice this morning." Evelyn blinked. "Why I don't want to work for a company that tolerates silence," Leah said. "But I'm scared. I don't know what's next." Evelyn let the words settle before she spoke. "Courage," she said, "doesn't always come with clarity. Sometimes it's a flicker, but you keep it alive by choosing truth even when it's inconvenient." Leah didn't speak for a while. Then, finally, with a shaky laugh, she said, "You really are the woman everyone says you are. I'm just someone who stayed seated." Evelyn replied. Later that day, Roderick Hale posted a follow-up video. This time, he wasn't in an airport. He was in his car, parked outside a neighborhood cafe. "I've been thinking a lot," he said into the camera, "about what it means to be seen, about how long black folks have been told to wait for justice, how we've been gaslighted into thinking politeness is a solution to systemic rot." He leaned closer to the camera, but Evelyn Moore didn't raise her voice. She didn't curse, she didn't scream, she just sat in that seat like she was supposed to, and somehow that was still too much for them. He paused. "If your comfort depends on my submission, then maybe you were never comfortable with my existence in the first place." The video spread like wildfire. Schools shared it in classrooms, churches played it during Sunday messages. It was more than commentary, it was a mirror. Back at Aero Vista headquarters, Christopher received an alert. One of the employees placed on administrative leave, Natalie Voss, had given an anonymous interview to a fringe podcast. In it, she claimed she was being scapegoated. That woman made a scene. Natalie said, "How was I supposed to know who she was? Why does everything have to be about race?" Christopher closed the tab slowly. He didn't forward the clip. He didn't make a public statement. He didn't need to. Instead, he opened a new draft for internal policy reform. The header read, "Grace is not silence, a cultural reset." That night, as Evelyn watched the evening news, her reflection flickered back at her from the screen. But all she could see was herself years ago, sitting at a separate lunch table, being followed in a department store, holding her tongue when she was called Miss in places she'd earned the title Ma'am. She wasn't looking for revenge. She was looking for repair. And slowly, she saw signs of it. A letter arrived by courier that evening from a woman named Carol Whitman, who had been seated in coach on Flight 226. It read, "Dear Mrs. Moore, I'm sorry I didn't speak up. I saw what they did. I saw the way they treated you, and I said nothing. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't know how to interrupt it. I've been thinking about that every hour since. Please accept this letter not as a fix, but as a promise. I will not be quiet next time." Evelyn folded the letter and placed it inside her Bible. Christopher called just after dinner. "You all right, Mama? I'm tired," she said. "I figured, but I'm not broken. I never thought you were." She smiled. "Neither did I." Outside her window, the wind was picking up. The world didn't look different. The trees swayed the same way. The sky dimmed like it always did. But inside her heart, there was a crack of light, the kind that only appeared after the storm passed and something had shifted. Something that would not shift back. Not this time. Not ever again. Christopher Moore stood at the massive glass window of his office on the 35th floor of the Aerovista building. The city stretched before him like a living map. But his gaze didn't see traffic or buildings. It lingered on a single thought that had been repeating in his mind all day. What if this hadn't happened to his mother? Would he have paid this much attention? He hated the question. Hated that it forced him to confront the uncomfortable reality that even people with good intentions often need personal pain to finally act. His executive assistant knocked gently before stepping in. "You asked to be informed when the audit results came in." Christopher turned, the weight of the day folding into the curve of his shoulders. "Yes, thanks. Jordan, leave them here. I'll read them tonight." As the door closed again, Christopher sat down slowly. He picked up the thick file, thumbed through it, and stopped on a page titled Passenger Complaints. Discrimination-related incidents. Last 18 months, there were 47 documented incidents. Some dismissed for lack of corroboration, others resolved internally. A handful had never even been followed up. Words like miscommunication, policy misunderstanding, and staff training issue had been scrawled in the margin beside experiences that were, at their core, about something else. About people being told they didn't belong. About people who looked like his mother being treated like background noise. He felt a tightness in his chest that didn't come from anger, but from a quiet, unbearable clarity. This wasn't just an isolated flight. It was a culture that had been allowed to rot under the surface. Later that evening, Evelyn Moore sat on her porch, listening to the soft rustle of wind through Georgia pines. She had always loved this hour just before the sky folded into navy, when birds settled, and the earth seemed to breathe in stillness. She held a worn photograph in her hands, her late husband in his military uniform, herself in a soft blue dress, and Christopher as a child, standing proudly between them with his hand gripping hers like it was the most natural place in the world. He had always looked at her like that, with trust, with admiration. But now she was beginning to see a shift in his eyes, like he had begun to carry her story, not just as his mother's pain, but as a call to action. She wasn't sure whether to be proud or sad that it had taken this long. The doorbell rang. She rose, unsure who would be visiting this late. When she opened the door, she was surprised to see a woman standing there, mid-40s, well-dressed, her posture stiff with anxiety. "Mrs. Moore," she asked. "Yes, my name is Lorraine Dixon. I was a flight attendant. I worked with Natalie Voss years ago." Evelyn didn't speak, but her expression invited the woman to continue. "I saw the story, the video. I had to come, because I didn't speak up when I should have. I watched Natalie do this kind of thing more than once. Subtler, maybe, but it was always there. The glances, the whispered comments, the preferential treatment." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Why didn't you say anything then?" Lorraine looked away, ashamed, "Because I was new and scared. And if I'm honest, I thought if I stayed quiet, it wouldn't touch me." Evelyn stepped aside and gestured toward the porch. "Sit." They sat together in silence for a long moment. Lorraine finally spoke again. "I quit 2 years ago. I thought I was putting that chapter behind me. But seeing what she did to you, the way she made you feel small, it reminded me that silence doesn't erase anything. It just delays the damage." Evelyn looked at her, her voice soft but steady. "Accountability begins with honesty, not with being perfect." Lorraine nodded slowly. "I want to testify if it helps your son's case. I want to tell the truth, even if it's late." Evelyn gave a gentle smile. It's never too late to stop hiding. The next morning, Christopher sat before a group of legal counsel and ethics committee members. Lorraine's testimony had been transcribed and submitted. It wasn't just powerful, it was detailed, credible, and damning. It opened the door to a wider investigation, not just into the Flight 226 crew, but into a broader cultural problem within the company's staffing and training practices. One committee member, a white woman named Cynthia Graves, leaned forward. "Christopher, I've been with this airline for over 15 years. I've seen trends, seen mistakes, but I've never seen you like this, like what he asked. Determined, unshakable, almost personal." He didn't smile. "It is personal," he said quietly. "But not just because it was my mother. It's personal because we fly thousands of people every day. And if even one of them walks away feeling lesser because of how they were treated, that should matter to every one of us." Outside the room, news continued to swirl. Public support was rising, but not without backlash. Online forums lit up with debates. Some accused Christopher of weaponizing his influence. Others claimed it was just a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But the voices that had long been silent were now finding each other. In a small cafe in Detroit, 2 elderly black women shared the story with a younger woman who recorded them for a local podcast. In Los Angeles, a university student wrote an op-ed titled "What Evelyn Moore Taught Me About Staying Seated." And in Washington, D.C., a nonprofit launched a campaign called Rightful Place, advocating for equitable training in airline staffing. Evelyn received a handwritten note from a young girl named Amaya in Tulsa. It read, "You look like my grandma. She says you were brave and quiet and strong. When I grow up, I want to be like that too." She cried for the first time in days reading that one. Tears not of grief, but of strange, full-circle hope. Back in Dallas, Christopher made a quiet call to Leah Tran. "Leah," he said, "I'd like you to come in. There's a role I want to talk to you about. It's new, but I think you're the right person to help rebuild what we've lost." There was a long pause on the other end. "You're serious?" she asked. "I'm offering you a seat," he said simply. "A rightful one." That evening, Evelyn watched the sunset alone again, but this time it didn't feel like solitude. It felt like a gathering of invisible threads, moments, people, regrets, choices all beginning to weave something new. She still carried the pain of that flight, the sting of humiliation, the ache of public scrutiny. But underneath it all was a quiet pride. Not because the world had finally noticed, but because she had stayed seated. And somehow, that had been enough to make the world stand still long enough to listen. The conference room at Aero Vista headquarters felt nothing like the sky. It was heavy with polished wood, legal pads, microphones, and unsmiling faces. Nothing about it gave the sensation of flight. But for Natalie Voss, seated on the opposite side of the table from the ethics committee, the altitude had never felt more dizzying. She wasn't in uniform. She had chosen a black pantsuit, hair tied back so tightly it looked like a mask. For the first time in years, there was no badge on her chest, no silver wings, just a name tag hastily clipped to her blazer, as if even the company wanted to remind her she wasn't part of it anymore. Across the room sat Evelyn Moore. Her presence was not planned. She was not required to be there. But when Christopher asked her gently the night before if she wanted to attend the final hearing, she didn't hesitate. Not for justice, not for drama, but because she believed in the simple power of presence. Evelyn sat quietly beside Christopher, a navy scarf wrapped loosely around her shoulders, eyes steady. She hadn't spoken a word since entering the room, but her silence radiated louder than most speeches. The lead investigator, a former federal compliance officer named Miriam Clay, began. "Ms. Voss, we've reviewed hours of testimony, including statements from passengers and former crew. What we seek today is clarity. Not spin, not defense, clarity." Natalie's voice cracked slightly as she responded, "I understand. You've worked in this airline for 18 years. Do you recognize that this was not your first complaint of discriminatory conduct?" Natalie hesitated. "I know some passengers have misinterpreted my intentions over the years, but I've always followed protocol." Evelyn's gaze did not waver. Miriam continued. "What exactly was the protocol in your mind when you told Mrs. Moore, an elderly black woman, that she must have wandered into the wrong cabin?" Natalie's mouth opened slightly. Her defense felt smaller now than it had sounded in her rehearsals. She was alone. She didn't look like our typical first-class passengers. I admit I made an assumption, but it wasn't about race. Roderick Hale, seated in the audience section reserved for witnesses, exhaled sharply. He had heard versions of this deflection his whole life. "It wasn't about race," Natalie repeated, more forcefully this time. "I was thinking about security. I've had training about people getting into the wrong section." She had no boarding pass visible. She didn't announce herself. Evelyn blinked slowly. "You didn't ask me to show one," Evelyn said calmly, the first word she had spoken all day. The room turned toward her. I had the pass in my hand. She added, "You didn't ask to see it. You looked at me, decided I didn't belong, and told me to leave." Natalie stiffened. It was an error in judgment. Miriam's voice remained even. "And yet your colleague, Mr. Fisk, corroborates that you referred to her as 'these people' shortly after." Natalie's eyes darted. I was frustrated. Did your frustration entitle you to humiliate someone in front of 27 passengers' silence? Christopher turned to his mother. "You don't have to say more," he whispered. But Evelyn shook her head, gently. "I was in seat 11G, she said slowly, as if naming the row gave it gravity. I was seated quietly when she approached me. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp, like I had committed a crime just by sitting where I was supposed to. I've lived through segregation, through signs that said colored only, and that day, for a moment, it felt like those signs were back. Only this time, they were invisible and spoken through policy instead of painted on walls. The room grew still. "I didn't speak out to destroy anyone," Evelyn said. "I spoke out because silence makes room for repetition." Natalie dropped her gaze. A new voice entered the room. "Leah Tran. I was on that flight," Leah said, "and I should have said something sooner. But I was scared. Not of Evelyn, of Natalie, of the whole culture. I saw how Natalie treated certain passengers over the years. It wasn't always obvious. Sometimes it was in the delay of a smile. Sometimes in the speed of service. But it added up. And I'm sorry I stayed quiet as long as I did." Christopher felt a wave of something in his chest. Not victory. Not revenge. Something more humbling. Vindication. He had seen companies spiral when they refused to name what was broken. And now he was watching his own company walk toward something different. Miriam turned to Natalie once more. "This committee recommends your termination with prejudice," she said. "Further, your professional conduct will be flagged to the Federal Aviation Ethics Board. But more than that, Ms. Voss, we hope this hearing reminds all of us that uniform and authority are never licenses for bias." Natalie didn't fight it. She didn't cry. She simply nodded, as if something inside her had finally conceded that the altitude she had floated in for years was never earned on merit, only on unspoken advantage. Outside the conference room, reporters gathered. Public interest in the story had only grown. Hashtags trended daily. Evelyn's face, once wrinkled with fatigue and grief, was now being celebrated as a symbol of courage. But she didn't want symbols. She wanted systems to change. That afternoon, Evelyn walked alone through the airline's internal training facility. Christopher had asked her to review the new inclusivity module being developed. He wanted her insight, not as a formality, as a compass. She paused beside a mock-up of a plane cabin, rows of empty first-class seats awaiting simulation. She sat down in 11G, closed her eyes, let the silence fill in what was missing. Behind her, the new training director, Leah, approached. "I wanted to show you something," Leah said. On the screen at the front of the training room, a video played. It was short, just under a minute, but it showed a flight attendant welcoming a diverse range of passengers into first class. No hesitation, no assumption, no policing of who looked right. Just dignity. Evelyn watched, then turned to Leah. "Make sure they don't just watch it," she said. "Make sure they understand it." Leah nodded, her voice tight with emotion. "Yes, ma'am." That evening, Evelyn sat on the hotel balcony as dusk settled over the city. A gentle breeze curled through her hair. She looked out at the sky, imagining all the flights in motion above, each carrying people who deserved to arrive not just safely, but seen. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something lighter than justice. She felt peace. 3 days had passed since the hearing, and Evelyn Moore was still receiving handwritten letters. Not emails, not tweets, not hashtags, letters, sealed envelopes arriving at her door in neat stacks, some postmarked from Atlanta, others from Chicago, New York, and one even from Anchorage. Inside, each one carried more than ink. They carried confessions, memories, small truths that strangers finally dared to say aloud. Evelyn sat at the small desk in her suite, reading them slowly, one by one. There was one from a retired teacher in North Carolina who had once been told she couldn't enter a first-class lounge without a male companion. Another from a young flight attendant who said watching Evelyn speak in that hearing gave her the courage to report a manager who'd made comments about passenger types. They weren't all stories of victory. Some were simply acknowledgments, and those, in their honesty, were just as powerful. Christopher entered the room, holding a leather-bound folder. "You're still reading them?" he asked gently. Evelyn smiled faintly. "They're still arriving." He handed her the folder. "Thought you'd want to see this." Inside was the press release from Aerovista's corporate office. It was titled, "A Sky for All Our Commitment to Dignity Above Altitude." Christopher watched her as she read through the paragraphs, her eyes narrowing, pausing, nodding. There were new policies outlined, a rewritten training manual, a mandatory quarterly seminar on cultural humility, a new internal role, Director of Passenger Equity. "I want Leah to have that role," Evelyn said, tapping the page. Christopher smiled. Already offered. She accepted. Then he leaned on the edge of the desk, the sunlight from the window catching his expression in a rare moment of vulnerability. "You know, when I started this airline, I thought we were already better than the rest, more inclusive, more modern, but it took this, what happened to you, for me to realize how many gaps were hiding in our pride." Evelyn reached out, her hand resting gently on his. "It's not about pride. It's about listening when someone tells you where it hurts." That night, Evelyn found herself scrolling through a video on her phone. It was the clip Roderick Hale had posted from the plane the moment she was told to move, followed by the silence that fell when she stood her ground. The video had reached nearly 12 million views, but what caught her attention most were the comments. At first, they were raw, angry. Then, slowly, a pattern emerged. People weren't just commenting on what happened to her. They were sharing stories of their own mothers, their own grandmothers, their own silence. That's when Evelyn understood something deeper. This was no longer just about one seat or one flight. It was about what happens when a society quietly agrees on who belongs where, and what happens when someone decides not to accept that agreement anymore. The next morning, Aerovista hosted a press event. A small stage was set up in the terminal at Grand Oak International Airport. There was no velvet rope, no first-class lounge, just a wide-open space where anyone could stand. Christopher stepped up to the podium, flanked by Leah Tran, Roderick Hale, and several passengers from Flight AV-716. Evelyn stood just off stage, wrapped in her navy scarf. Christopher took a breath and began. We're here today not to defend ourselves, but to change ourselves. My mother, Evelyn Moore, was mistreated aboard one of our planes. She was profiled, disrespected, and publicly humiliated. And instead of allowing that moment to be swept away or spun into apology theater, she chose to stand in it, calmly, firmly, and because of that, we listened. He turned slightly toward the crew behind him. And now, we act. He listed the reforms: transparent incident review boards, a whistleblower hotline that bypassed middle management, a diversity council that would include external civil rights advisors, not just internal staff. But then, he paused. And there's one more thing, he said. He stepped aside, motioning toward Evelyn. I didn't ask her to speak. She doesn't owe anyone that. But if she wants to, I'd be honored. Evelyn hadn't planned to. But she walked forward anyway. Her steps were measured, quiet. A soft hush rippled through the crowd as she reached the podium. I don't have a speech, she began. I'm not a performer. I'm a mother, a passenger, and a person who spent a lifetime learning how to walk through rooms that didn't think I belonged. She looked up, meeting the eyes of people in the terminal, not just executives, but workers, janitors, travelers. I'm not here to shame, she said. I'm here to name the hurt, the habits, the silences. And if naming those things helps us fly a little more justly, then I'm grateful. There was no applause, just silence, a good silence, one that listens. Later, as Evelyn walked through the terminal, a young man stopped her. Early 20s, light brown skin, nervous eyes. Ms. Moore, he said, his voice tight. I watched the hearing. My grandmother. She always told me stories like that. I thought they were just history, but you made me realize they're still happening. And I just wanted to say thank you. Evelyn touched his hand lightly. Now you know, and now you can do something about it. That afternoon, Evelyn sat once again by the window in her suite. Outside, planes glided across the sky. She thought of Natalie Voss, of people like her, not monsters, but mirrors of a system that taught them to trust one image of power and fear the rest. She didn't wish Natalie harm. She wished her clarity, humility, the kind of discomfort that makes people grow. A knock came at the door. It was Leah. I just got the job title officially posted, she said, beaming. Director of Passenger Equity. Evelyn smiled. Then, let's make sure it means something. As Leah turned to go, she paused. You know, I think passengers are going to feel something different now. When they step onto our planes, Evelyn raised an eyebrow. And what's that dignity at 30,000 feet? Evelyn chuckled softly. It's about time. The sunlight spilled softly through the window of Evelyn Moore's small home in Charleston, South Carolina. Outside, birds sang against the backdrop of a peaceful summer morning, the kind where the world feels still enough to listen. She sat at her kitchen table, a worn but well-loved oak surface with a small chip in the corner her late husband once tried to fix. The aroma of steeped jasmine tea curled through the air. In front of her lay a small stack of newspaper clippings. One of them headlined, "A Mother's Seat Sparks a Movement in the Skies." She hadn't asked for that seat. She hadn't asked for attention or cameras or panels of executives staring at her as if she were both witness and mirror. But life had a strange way of choosing its moments. Evelyn had never believed in grand victories. Her mother taught her that the most important changes often happened in quiet spaces, over a dinner table, on a bus ride, in a classroom, or, sometimes, in seat 1A at 30,000 feet. That memory still came back in flashes. The tension in her hands when Natalie Voss first told her she didn't belong there. The sound of Roderick's camera clicking. The tears she refused to let fall. And most of all, her son's face when he realized the weight of what had happened. Christopher had returned to Charleston 2 days earlier. He walked into her house carrying groceries, a humble gesture that made Evelyn smile with pride. It didn't matter how many airlines he ran or policies he changed. To her, he would always be the boy who insisted on carrying her purse in second grade because her hands were full. Now, he stood at the edge of the kitchen, a mug in his hand, watching her read the paper. "They're already asking for interviews," he said. "CNN, The View, even a documentary crew." Evelyn folded the paper gently and set it aside. "I'm not a story," she said. "I'm a reminder." Christopher nodded slowly, a powerful one. They didn't speak for a moment. The silence was companionable, filled with the kind of understanding that only family shares after fire and healing. Outside, the front doorbell rang. Evelyn looked up, eyebrows raised. "You expecting someone?" Christopher shook his head. "Nope." When Evelyn opened the door, a small group of girls stood on her porch. 4 of them, no older than 9 or 10, all dressed in matching navy polos. Behind them stood a woman in her 30s, holding a clipboard. "Are you Ms. Evelyn Moore?" the woman asked. "I am," Evelyn said kindly. "We're from the Charleston Girls Academy." She explained, "These students recently read about what happened to you. They asked to meet you." One of the girls, with curly hair tied in a bright yellow bow, stepped forward. "Ms. Moore," she said, her voice a bit shaky but sincere. "Thank you for standing up when they tried to push you down. My grandma said I should always watch how strong women sit." Evelyn blinked, deeply moved. "Well," she said, crouching gently to meet the girl's eyes, "sometimes the best kind of strength is sitting quietly and not moving at all." The girls beamed. The woman offered Evelyn a folder. "It's a project they made, letters, drawings. Some of them want to be pilots, others CEOs. Evelyn held the folder close to her chest. "Then let's make sure there are seats waiting for them." Later that night, Evelyn sat on her front porch beneath the soft canopy of stars. Christopher sat beside her, their chairs rocking slowly in tandem. A gentle breeze moved through the magnolia trees. He turned toward her, his face serious but peaceful. "You know, Mom, before this flight, I thought I understood what it meant to lead. I thought changing numbers and policies made me good at my job." He looked down, then back at her. "But watching how you stayed still, calm, unshaken, it taught me something else." Evelyn smiled faintly, which is that dignity doesn't ask for permission, and justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stays seated. They rocked in silence again, the kind that comes not from absence of words but from fullness of feeling. The next morning, Evelyn received a letter from Leah Tran, handwritten. "Dear Ms. Moore," it began, "I wanted you to know that we've launched the passenger equity program across all domestic flights, and I've been asked to train new hires on human dignity and unconscious bias. Every time I walk into that room, I carry your voice with me. Thank you for staying seated. With respect and hope, Leah Tran." Evelyn touched the letter to her lips and smiled. Later that week, Aravista Airlines rolled out their Seat with Honor initiative, a campaign to ensure passengers of all backgrounds were treated not based on assumptions, but humanity. Evelyn's story was never used as a gimmick. Instead, her quietest stance became the standard. At the end of the month, Evelyn received a call from a major university. They wanted to create a scholarship in her name for first-generation Black female students entering the field of aviation or public policy. She accepted on one condition: I want it named not after me, but after the seat I refuse to leave. Let it be called the 1A Fund. The representative paused, then agreed. That's powerful. Evelyn hung up the phone and looked out her window. A plane traced a clean white arc across the sky, silent and assured, and for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. What had begun as a humiliation ended in a healing. What started in silence ended in signal. Evelyn had never intended to be the spark, but sometimes the world lights a fire where it least expects to find a flame. Evelyn Moore never wanted to become a symbol. She didn't shout, she didn't threaten. She just stayed seated in a chair she rightfully paid for. In dignity she quietly carried all her life. But the world saw, and the world remembered, because what happened to her was not just about policy. It was about perception, about power, about who we believe belongs in the front, and who we push to the back. In those 30 minutes, her son, CEO Christopher Moore, could have chosen silence. Instead, he chose transformation. The entire crew was fired, new equity programs were launched, and the seat Evelyn refused to give up became a scholarship for generations to come. This isn't just a story about injustice. It's a reminder that every seat tells a story, and when we choose to listen, truly listen, we change what's possible for the next person who boards that flight. So, the next time someone asks, "Why does this matter?" tell them about Evelyn Moore. Tell them what happened on Flight 716, and tell them we're still watching the skies. If this story moved you, made you think, or made you feel like, share and subscribe. We have more true stories ahead, stories of courage, compassion, and quiet power. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay kind and stay grounded.